Thank you all for joining us. We are close to the end of the NTRAP project work, but not the end of the work we need to do to disseminate and implement the project. And so we wanted to pull this group together again, just to sort of give you an overview of the work that's been accomplished in the three aims, sort of the big picture here. And then really, we want your input and discussion around next steps. We have put together a communication dissemination plan. We want your feedback on that. We had a really good session, lunch session at the AAST, where some additional ideas were generated that I'll talk about when we get to the discussion phase. But we thought we'd just start with a high level overview of each aim. And so I'm going to do aim 1, and then Juan's going to present aim 2 and Michelle aim 3. And we can kind of pause after each one and just to see what people are thinking. And then Pam will present the draft communication dissemination plan that we have for your feedback. So that's kind of the plan for the time. And we may end early, but we wanted to give plenty of time for discussion. So we left this at 2 hours, but we're also recording the session for any of the steering committee members that couldn't make it in the middle of the day. So we'll send it out to them as well and get their feedback. So this is just the usual funding acknowledgement. So again, this is our plan. I'll talk about, aim 1, and then we'll do aim 2 and aim 3, and then the communication plan. Good to see you, Martin. So you all remember that this came directly out of the NASEM report, trying to fulfill a deliverable from the report. I hope we have met that mark. That's the goal. Next slide. And here you all are as the steering committee members. So thank you again. This seems like years ago that we actually sat in a room and talked about how to actually organize this project. So a lot has happened since then, but we're incredibly grateful for your input as we move forward. Next slide. So just to remind you what our 3 aims were, aim 1 was really focused on creating the research agenda, the gap analysis of both military and civilian trauma research to identify and prioritize our research agenda across the continuum of care. And I'll talk about that. And then aim 2 is really focused on the long-term functional outcomes. What are the best metrics for that? And can we come to some standardization there? And then aim 3 really focused on working with regulatory agencies, identifying regulatory barriers, and developing a toolkit for investigators. And Michelle will talk about that. Next slide, please. So let's aim 1. Let's keep going. Yep. So just to remind you also, at the beginning of this project, we reached out to all of these specialty societies, again, trying to have broad stakeholder engagement in the project. All of these groups nominated people to be on the Delphi panels. So we had pretty good diversity there. And I think then, therefore, an opportunity to go back to these groups to report out our findings and get their engagement in the dissemination and communication strategy. Next slide. So we had 11 Delphi panels in aim 1, which this group helped us shape. We tried to be very inclusive and cover the broad array of trauma care, whether it was pre-hospital care, long-term outcomes, specific special populations, geriatrics, pediatrics, specific areas of specialty focus like orthopedics and neurotrauma. So I think we did a pretty good job of being very inclusive, and all of this work is done and nearly all published. We'll talk about where we are still finishing up. You remember we used the Delphi message, which I think really served us well, especially when we tried to run these during the pandemic. Next slide. So these are the total number of research questions that were generated in each area. You can see that poor Todd had the largest panel subject area, which we kept expanding to fill any gaps that we had. But thousands of research questions were generated by each panel, which I think does highlight the amount we don't know about what we're actually doing. But then we worked to obviously get consensus and prioritize these. Next slide. So each paper includes a table like this, which shows the top research questions in each area with their a consensus rate, and we used a greater than 60% consensus to make the list. And then their mean score on the Likert scale for priority. And you can see, that we went, this is from the neurotrauma paper that Deb wrote, went into quite a bit of detail to just sort of lay out the top priorities in each area. Next slide. But in addition to that, we took extra time, and this is what took a lot of time, but I think in the end was a very wise decision to code every question that reached consensus with a taxonomy that included keywords in these different areas. So the type of research, what phase of care the question was related to, pre-hospital, in-hospital, post-hospital sort of thing, the type of injury pattern, specific populations. And what this allows us to do is now search across panels. So we just did a test of this after the VTE conference. We said, we want to see what all the questions are that are related to VTE. I'm sorry, go back for a second. And across all the panels, and that pulled out a really nice secondary analysis. So having this structure in our database, allowing us to work across panels, I think was a very smart move. And although it took a lot of time, was very worthwhile. Next slide. You'll see throughout all of the papers, these sort of stacked bar graphs, which allow some visualization based on the keywords. So this particular one is looking at type of injury, and you can see in this particular panel, which I think was acute resus, that traumatic brain injury had the highest number of high priority questions, and you can kind of get a little bit of a sense of taking basically qualitative data and making it a little bit quantitative, which helps people visualize the project. Next slide. We also then worked with the Journal of Trauma, and all these manuscripts are in the Journal of Trauma, to create a collection on their website so people could find them easily. So they're all in one place. We have published 9 of the 11 panels. The trauma systems panel is imminently being submitted for review. It's done. And the only outstanding one is orthopedics. And I'm leaning pretty hard on that leader to try to work on that, because that's the only panel left to be published from AIM-1. Next slide. So this is just a list of the current publications, and great kudos work to all of those who led the panels and really helped drive each of these publications to completion. So this is an example of the secondary analysis that we've done for VTE, and I think Todd and Elliot are going to write this up. But we identified 94 questions across 9 different panels. So I think it's really valuable to look at the different perspective the different panels might have taken relative to VTE. And we could do this for pretty much any other thing you can think of. If you care about rib fractures, I don't know, whatever you care about, you could do this across the panels and write a secondary paper. And so we're really promoting that concept. Next slide. So I want to stop there. That's the summary of where we are with AIM-1, and get your feedback on what you think the next steps are there. I think one of the things that did come up in the discussion at the lunch session at AAST, and this was brought up by Captain Polk, who is now in the office that funded this work, that it would be nice to find a way to make this a living process, rather than a snapshot in time, but some way to update this plan over time as new things come available that we need to study. So we're thinking a little bit about that, as well as how to best disseminate this and get it to funding agencies. So let me stop there, see what questions and thoughts you guys have about AIM-1.
Eileen, it's Rosemary. About the funding agencies, would it be to help them craft like an RFA based on the priorities, or to carry out some of the questions? Just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to think about the right approach there. I do think this is extremely valuable data to anybody writing a grant, because if you're writing a grant and you want to show significance, right, and you can say, this is where this question that I want to study fits into the National Trauma Research Action Plan, how it was, it was rated as a priority, blah, blah, I think.
Or a gap in our knowledge, that was my
Yeah,
statement.
for demonstrating a gap in knowledge, for demonstrating that this is a high priority issue in the trauma community. I do think that it's valuable on that side of it. I don't know the best strategy on the other side of it. I do think the DoD, because they funded the project, will be looking at the list and thinking about how it might incorporate their funding priorities. They've already asked to pull the military specific questions that were included so they can look at those. I told them that, there's military specific, but there's also military relevant. May not have mentioned military, but it may be very relevant to them. So figuring out how to identify those for them is important, but
That could be
outside
an
of the
interesting
DoD,
paper, Eileen.
yeah.
Having
And-
someone
and-
from the military, yeah.
Travis is interested in doing that. He's already asked for that data and he's going to try to pull together the military members from all the panels to work on that. But interested in other thoughts about approaching or dealing with funding agencies on this or anybody else.
I wonder how to potentially put together sort of a short list of the priorities that we identified from all panels combined. I think it might be a little bit overwhelming to look at 11 papers with thousands of questions and say, this is what we should fund. I wonder if together we should come up with the top 20, the highest consensus questions that maybe, overlapped or really rose to the top and try to be a little bit more clear on what we want them to fund.
I think that's a really good point. We have talked about putting together sort of an executive summary for the project anyway, and that might be the opportunity to do that.
I wonder if there's the opportunity to use the taxonomy that you created to compile that. I mean, how many things span across multiple domains? There should be a way to do that mathematically or at least systematically, I would imagine. You probably need to re-engage a Jimmy type person to figure out how to do that. But I love that idea of looking at kind of the top 20 list as opposed to 11 separate documents. It's gonna be super overwhelming.
Are you guys hearing some weird feedback? What is that beeping?
Very strange.
Okay, it stopped. Oh.
How about now?
I don't know what it is. Anyway,
I think it was me.
It was below.
It's always below.
I don't know. Maybe we're being Zoom bombed. But yes, I think that's a great idea, Deb. And my only challenge is just getting that last orthopedic paper out so that we can do that. But I think you're right. I think looking across all the if anybody feels like they have enough expertise in orthopedics to write the orthopedic paper, let me know. I wrote the trauma systems paper to get it done. But I feel like I have enough expertise in orthopedics. But yeah, I think
Does Jim want help? I mean, I think most of this is really the methodology of how you get kind of collate this mass of
yeah.
stuff. And I think that so I sort of be happy to give him a hand if he just needs to kind of wrap his head around how to present it, because that I struggled with that a huge amount. I'm sure everybody did. Nicole,
I'll
was
let him know.
helpful with
I'll let
that.
him know since you're in his town. I've talked to him several times. I've offered to have calls with him. But maybe that would help.
Yeah, I'm happy to give Jim a hand if he would like. I too don't have the subject matter expertise, but the methodology I think was something that's hard for me.
Yeah, great. All right, that's a good idea though. And
Bilal,
then,
I'm sorry to
Go ahead.
interrupt. I'll put a comment in the chat. His sound is messed up. He said, could we hold an event in DC and invite different program officers from, DOD, NIH, and PCORI to a half-day presentation or host them at ACS?
Yeah, that's a great idea. We've been thinking a lot about that. I've been talking with Travis because obviously I'd like the DoD to fund it if we're going to have a conference. They were talking initially about doing a follow-up to the NASM report anyway, and then we could be a piece of that meeting. And so, yeah, I think we just need to continue to lean on that. I think that's an absolutely great idea, and that would I would definitely hold it in DC. I think that's the right place to have it. And just, share with this project with them, and at least get them aware of it. All right, well, let's go on to aim 2, and we'll have a lot more time at the end to think about the whole project, but I want to give Juan time to share all the great work that you guys have done with aim 2.
Thank you, Dr. Buljo. Next slide. So aim 2, the goal for aim 2 was to define optimal metrics to assess long-term trauma outcomes. And to accomplish this, we followed a 3-step process. The first one was the PROMS Consensus Conference, which was really the one who laid the groundwork for conducting the next steps. Then the second was a scoping review on available measures for tracking long-term outcomes in trauma. And then we finalized all this with a Delphi process to determine which outcomes and which instruments should we use to track those outcomes. So this diagram kind of summarized that process. And so for the Delphi process specifically, we have 2 stages. The first one that was focused on determining what outcomes are the most important that we should be measuring in the long term. And once we have identified those, then which instruments we should be using to track these outcomes. And then ultimately with the goal to develop a core long-term patient-reported outcome measurement set for traumatic injury, so that hopefully researchers interested in conducting research in this area utilize in the future. So coming back to the PROMS Consensus Conference, so this was a conference that was hosted by the ACS Committee on Trauma in 2019 in DC, and it was a great kickoff for this specific aim. And we had very interesting conversations around the who, when, how, and what should we measure in terms of long-term outcomes in trauma. And those conversations were the foundations for creating the protocol for the scoping review, which was the next step. Next slide. So, but one of the most important things that came out from this conference was the framework of establishing 4 different health domains, which are mental, physical, social, and cognitive, that kind of encompass most of the outcomes that we were interested in tracking in the field. And the proceedings of this conference were published in JACS in 2020. So it's described there in more detail. And then the next step was the scoping review. And next slide. So for this, the main objective of this was to identify and summarize the measures that were being used to track long-term patient-reported outcomes among adults after injury. Next slide, please. And we specifically were interested in follow-up times between 6 months and 10 years after injury. We included papers that conducted studies in all types of injuries, severities, and that analyzed primary data. And then there's some other more specific inclusion/exclusion criteria that were published in the protocol in SACO in 2020. And there you can find more specific details about that. But next slide, please. It was a pretty large review. It started with over 13,000 papers, and we end up with a total of 747, which is still pretty large for scoping reviews. And next slide, please. And a few things to highlight about that review. Kind of as expected, most research in this area were coming from the US, smaller sample sizes for most studies. And they were primarily focused on orthopedic injury and traumatic brain injury. So these 2 conditions actually accounted for over 2/3 of the available literature in long-term outcomes in trauma. Interestingly, in terms of the outcomes that these papers were measuring, most of them were on the mental, physical, and quality of life domains. Less frequently assessed, there were the cognitive and the social health domains. And collectively, for the 747 papers, we end up identifying over 2,000 constructs for a median of 2 constructs per article that we looked at. So this is the list of the 74 unique constructs that we identified in the scoping review. So these are 74 specific outcomes that this group were, the different studies were researching. And as you can see from this list, it's a pretty diverse in terms of the things that we're measuring. There are some outcomes that pertain to the mental health, to the physical, cognitive, etc. Next slide, please. And the most frequently assessed outcomes for each domains are described here in this 4 tables. So for mental health, for example, we found out that depression was measured in 28% of the cases, and then for cognitive health, it was post-concussion symptoms. For physical health, it was physical functioning, and so on. Next slide, please. So a few takeaways from this review. Again, like I mentioned, the smaller sample sizes, most of them, as kind of as expected in this field, were observational studies, and there were very few truly RCTs, and there was a huge disbalance in the amount of research between and within health domains. There were also too many prompts that were used to measure the same construct, and one particular thing that we also noticed was that there were very few studies on special populations and a disbalance in the amount of research between injury groups. Next slide, please. So a concrete example of this was the case of firearm injuries. So we conducted a parallel scoping review leveraging the infrastructure that we developed for the main scoping review to see what was what articles were out there for investigating long-term outcomes after firearm injuries. And the findings were kind of, I mean, not surprising, unfortunately, given the small amount of funding that have been allocated to this type of work. But there were only a handful of papers, despite all of them pointing out a huge burden that these patients experience in the long term in the multiple health domains. So finally, we conducted the Delphi process. And for this, we followed a very similar process that was conducted for the AIM-1 panels. So I'm not gonna talk a lot about those details because it's very similar, but I do want to highlight that we have in our panels 3 group of participants. One were clinicians, the second was researchers, and the third was patients and patient advocates. So like I said, for the Delphi process, there were 2 stages. The first one was to determine which outcomes are the ones we should be measuring. And then once we have identified those, we moved to a second stage, which was to identify which specific patient-reported outcome measures or prompts are the most optimal to measure those outcomes or constructs. So for the first part, it was focused on importance of the construct, and then for the second stage, it was more sort of on the feasibility, on the psychometric soundness of the different tools, and then on the usability of these specific prompts. So we end up identifying a total of 29 out of the 74 constructs that we identified in the review. 29 were deemed as important, and among those 29 specific constructs, we identified 198 different patient-reported outcome measures, and they were distributed across the different health domains, as you can see in the red boxes. Then with this information, we followed the COSMIN initiative framework, which is a framework that helps develop kind of a core consensus on which prompts are ideal for tracking this type of outcomes. So it provides some practical tools for informing how the selection process should be of these different measures. So we collect all this information, we gathered information on these different prompts to present to all the different panelists before the voting process of the Delphi. And this information was focused around 3 areas, which were the areas that we asked panelists to provide a rating for. These were feasibility, so things like the length of the instrument, the cost, whether or not a copyright was needed, the usability, so things like the target population, availability of scores, and psychometric standards, which was more focused on reliability and validity. So this is an example of how that looked like. So we had the construct at the top, the definition of the specific construct, and then in the different rows, we have the prompts that were identified to be measuring that specific construct, and then an opportunity for the panelists to rank on feasibility, usability, psychometric soundness, and provide an overall rating of the prompt. So this is the final product of the AIM2, which is this core outcome measurement set. And as you can see here, there were some, so each of the columns represent one of the health domains. And for some of the outcome measures, there were at least one or some more specific prompts that were deemed as optimal for tracking this type of outcomes. But for some others, all measures were rejected, or they weren't measures identified in the first place, which is something I'll bring up a little bit later when we get to the discussion. Next slide, please. And then these results were published in the Journal of Trauma earlier this year, and as part of that paper, we also proposed a configuration how this different outcomes and measures should be combined if we were to collect this in a systematic fashion or include them in trauma registries. So we propose an essential and an extended configuration of these different tools, and with the essential configuration having key advantages such as no license fees required. It takes approximately 20 minutes to complete. And one of the things I do want to highlight is that for most of these prompts that were identified, there was a particular interest that was given to the promise measures, which we were identified as optimal for many different outcome measures. So some of the next steps and kind of the conversation I think should follow after this AIM are around different areas. So here are some, but of course we're open to hear your thoughts on and how we can and what are the next steps for this AIM. But some of the things are around inclusion of long-term patient-reported outcomes into trauma registers, how to implement that at the national level, and maybe start exploring methods for data collection on how to kind of facilitate all this effort. And then also, as we hear from Dr. Livingston in the presidential address in AASD, there are some other ways we can measure the recovery of trauma patients different than the prompts. So looking at different alternatives to prompts to capture the recovery of patients, it's an area that I think we should also look into, and ask with AIM1 how to maintain the relevance of this different outcomes and different prompts as this field keeps rapidly evolving. So that's what I have to share for AIM2. So I'll be happy to answer any questions or if there's any comments.
So really outstanding presentation, a tremendous amount of work, as you can see. going into aim 2. Feedback, questions, comments?
Pablo, I know that that the timing may have just been off for this, but I know with the COT's interest in collecting patient-reported outcomes as part of that pilot project that Avery is doing, were we able to use any of these data that you're presenting here to inform that process, or did the timing just miss?
Well, I think that they were aware of the data. I think that for simplicity in what they're currently trying to do, which is like 3 questions on an app, they were going with something called the EQ5.
Yeah.
But which didn't come up in our thing as a significant, as this, you know,
Right.
and like, you know, it was there, it was in the review, but it didn't come up as one of the core measures.
Yep.
So we're a little bit discordant, I would say, with that project.
But maybe we can help inform as because I mean, obviously that project is looking at feasibility right now. Maybe we can make sure that this aligns with if and when we decide that's something that would be required or expected, or, you know, this aligns with that a little bit better.
Yeah, and I had Avery on the panel at the WST lunch session for that very purpose.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on it strikes me as we have to have a way to find out the data. You can't include it in the registry unless you know what it is. And that to me is the hardest part of all of this. A real struggle.
Yeah, and that's what the TQIP program is piloting. It'd be like an automated text message that comes to your phone at certain time points after injury and asks you to answer 5 questions or something like that. Whether people will do that or not, I don't know, but that's what they're going to pilot.
Hey, Michelle, I wonder if there's a possibility to incorporate some of this into some of the work that we're doing with NTRAP as we think about these surveys. So just for those of you who don't know, and I certainly don't want to monopolize this conversation by any means, but Michelle and I are very involved in this creation of an injury research engagement panel, and we are in phase 2 of that project right now, or I guess we're finishing up phase 1, entering into phase 2, which is going to be surveying patients and caregivers and researchers. And I wonder if we could maybe take advantage of some of what you've already collected to leverage with respect to some questions, like how long are you willing to sit through? Would you answer a 3-question survey if it got emailed to you or texted to you, or and maybe take some of what you guys have already done here and help to validate how our patients and caregivers would feel about those types of instruments.
That's a terrific idea.
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we could embed something in the survey about, if you're interested in this, please click here, and like have them take it online and see how they feel about it. And you know what I mean? Like a little spin-off of the surveys that we're putting together anyway. I would have to figure out how to operationalize that, but we may be able to get some data about how the patients feel about this. Like what you just showed, if you go back a slide, that big graphic of all those different instruments, which one?
Oh, you went on mute, Deb.
Sorry. Just get some actual data from the patients about how we feel about it, how they feel about it, I should say.
I wonder also if it would be feasible to ask them about the 29 outcomes that came out as being the most important. You know, do they also think these are the most important things, or how important do they
How
think
do they rank them? Yeah.
it's like a secondary validation of, you know, the outcomes?
Pablo, what do you think about? Would you be willing to help us out with some of that?
One.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, for the voting process for this, we did have some patients that were providing the input. They weren't as much as we initially kind of planned for. So I think that the total number was, you know, they were way underrepresented as well. So I think it would be a great second validation on kind of on a larger patient and also like family members population, which I think it's critical for trauma survivors.
Maybe we'll get back in touch with you and ask you to work with us to put together a relatively short part of a survey or something that we could include.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll be happy to work with you on that.
Thanks, Mom.
Any other thoughts on aim 2?
I mean, I think that the key thing here is if this is what we feel are the most important outcome measures to be capturing, then we should be promoting that as part of all of our research. And I think that whether we go back to then our member organizations like AAST and East and Western and say, these are the things that we should be collecting as part of the research that we are sponsoring and we are promoting. And we should do that systematically. I mean, Michelle, Todd, Rosemary, and I have all been involved in a number of conversations about how to kind of coalesce some of the research efforts among the member organizations anyway. This would certainly be something as we look at utilizing the NTR for a data repository and mandating some core elements and that type of thing. This certainly should be something that we're incorporating in those discussions, which we haven't started to, but we absolutely should.
Yeah, sounds good. Al?
You know, I really like what you're saying there, Deb. And by the way, you know, Juan, really incredible. I mean, obviously, it's just that you kind of had to take this on, you know, all sort of almost by yourself, because I sort of disappeared. But it's just wonderful to see how you've done this for the past couple of years. And I'm saying this sort of mea culpa in front of everybody here about how much you've had to do for this. But I really like what you're saying, Deb, there. You know, for another group, we wrote like methods papers. And this is for like looking at doing different types of studies. And we wrote a method paper in JAMA surgery, for example. And so many papers now come there with that methods paper sort of referenced. And I wonder if there's some sort of way we could, maybe what we already have is good enough, or is there another viewpoint or some other thing that could be written by some substantive authors or even editors, maybe of the Trauma Surgery Acute Care Open or something like that, to say that these are measures that editors are looking for that might push people to really include them in their studies.
It's a good idea. We'll think about that a little bit.
I think it would be really nice and obviously wonderful to get more publications out of all of this, both the AIM 1 and AIM 2. But I think to kind of a little bit to Bilal's point, this is about putting this information that has been amassed in front of people who then can affect change. And so I totally agree that yes, we should be publishing as much as we can and getting that there in literature. But I also think about ways to have this be actionable is going to be really important as we move forward, so that it actually winds up making a difference on the back end.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. We'll get the summary of AIM 3 and then we'll look at the whole thing together. So Michelle? And thank you for leading this AIM.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. I was reflecting back today. I was thinking, when did we have that first steering committee meeting? And it was the day before the PROMS conference back in January of 2019. So
that was the day I quit smoking, by the way.
Oh,
January 4th, 2019.
Congratulations.
A day that will live in infamy.
great. So we spend time on the background. You all know very well the challenges of conducting human subjects research in emergency settings. And so one of the NASEM report recommendations, number 8, called for the identification of regulatory barriers and suggested that federal agencies should work to revise those regulations and offer policy statements where some clarity would be helpful to researchers. So we set about to identify what those regulatory challenges are. And next slide, please. We started by conducting a scoping review. So using very similar methodology to what Juan just talked about in AIM 2. Next slide, please. we did a scoping review looking at regulatory papers in trauma or emergency settings, research, and we looked at articles published from 2007 through 2020, so 14 years, and we identified just under 2,200 articles initially, and then going through the same reviewing process that we used on AIM-2, we ended up with 289 articles that were read and analyzed in detail. Next slide, please. So we took all of these papers and we identified the regulatory topics that were addressed in the papers. So that with most papers, as you can imagine, there was more than one topic identified. There were 15 topics overall, and there you see a count just by numbers of papers that address those topics. Next slide, please. So then we looked at what were the top 10 regulatory topics coming up in these papers. And no surprise, informed consent was the most frequently addressed issue. It was in 78% of the papers, followed by general research ethics topics dealing with IRBs, enrollment, informed consent, and exception from informed consent or EFIC. And then also issues with legally authorized representatives, patient safety, community consultation, waiver of consent, and general recruitment challenges were the top 10 in terms of mention. We also looked at whether the papers touched on issues pertaining to special populations. And by far the most frequent special population addressed was children, followed by victims of violence, which I know we're delving into that, the issue, the particular sensitivities around victims of violence and the NTRAP project that that Deb mentioned. And then you see the other special pops that were addressed. Next slide. So then our next task was to translate what we had seen in the literature into items that could be put into a Delphi survey. So that we could basically ask our panel about, whether these challenges were relevant and how significant these challenges were to conducting trauma research. So we took all the topics from these 289 articles. We wrote challenge statements. There's a team of 3 of us reviewed all the challenge statements, and then a 4th reviewer conducted a second level review for the clarity of the items, if the challenge statements made sense. Then we convened a panel of stakeholders, and you'll see here we invited stakeholders from 15 organizations and stakeholder groups. We were specific about inviting panelists from central IRBs like Advera and WERB. We had representation from the Food and Drug Administration, Department of Health and Human Services, Human Subjects Research Protection Office, and then all of the other professional organizations that you see there. So we invited 55 and 38 panelists agreed to participate, which was about 67%. So we were pretty pleased with that. Next slide. So this is just an overview of our process. We convened the panel and did a training webinar back in November of 2021. We ran 3 rounds of the Delphi survey, wherein the panelists would go in and rate each challenge statement on a Likert scale of 1 to 9, 1 being not at all challenging and 9 being very challenging. And then they went through the iterative process that you do with a scoping review, where they can see what others commented and how they rated the items, and they could adjust their scores if they felt like that was if that would be appropriate based on that feedback. And then we met with that panel again at the end of January of this year and presented the results of the Delphi survey and asked them for input. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So the Delphi survey, there were 175 regulatory challenges that were rated. 158 of those came from our scoping review, and then the panelists had the option of adding items. And so there were 17 items that were added by panelists during the survey. Of these, 141 of the statements reached the consensus threshold that we set, that was the same as with AIM-1, which was 60%. Of these consensus reaching statements, 42 of them had a challenge score of 6 or higher. So their mean challenge score was 6 or higher, indicating a significant amount of challenge or representing a significant barrier to conducting research. So I'll just run through the top 10 of these regulatory challenges just to give you an idea. By far the most most challenging statement in terms of its Likert mean score was obtaining written informed consent in a pre-hospital transport environment, which I'm sure everybody's like, yes, that makes a lot of course. Followed by obtaining informed consent for pediatric patients when there's potential of child abuse. And then just the overall issue of burdening parents and families by trying to recruit a patient during the vulnerable time of trauma. And then there was a lot of challenge statements and endorsement around issues with community consultation, what constitutes sufficient community consultation. And then the fifth is that you see there was the challenges of dealing with the approvals when you're doing an ethics study that's DoD funded, and you have to get that second level Secretary of the Army's approval. Next slide, please. Then here you see the 5th through the 10th most challenging statements. Conducting prospective or interventional studies in a pre-hospital or initial resuscitation period with pediatric trauma patients. And the next is using multiple IRBs with multiple interpretations and inconsistent interpretations across sites. I'm sure we've all dealt with that. Followed by working with local IRBs who've not been exposed or have very little experience with ethic. And then the question of determining whether, and I know I've had this conversation with many researchers, determining whether using only social media for ethic is sufficient for community consultation. And then the 10th was just that general issue of reducing misconceptions about research, whether it's exploitation or myths or perceived benefits. Okay, next slide. So after we presented these results in the webinar, we broke up into 3 groups with our panelists. One focused on perceptions and populations, one group focused on policies and IRBs, and then one group focused on participant enrollment. So that was more like the nuts and bolts of conducting the study. What we had them do was look at the challenge statements in their areas and decide whether any of those challenge statements should be combined into one, or if there seemed to be some duplication. But then we had them brainstorm with us about what should we be putting into what's going to become our investigator toolkit. So strategies that have worked, tips, lessons learned, suggestions for regulatory input and clarification, and also identifying existing resources that we should pull together to go into our investigator toolkit. And that was really helpful. So I will stop there and ask for feedback on AIM-3. So this could be your ideas about maybe some resources that you recommend that we put into this online toolkit that we're building as part of our deliverables. We also would like to encourage secondary analyses of the Delphi survey results. And we will also be looking at engaging, particularly CORI engagement as a potential source of funding for more work in this area. But I'd really like to hear your thoughts and feedback.
I think since so many of the questions related to EFIC, it might be nice to have a secondary paper talking specifically about EFIC challenges and, you know, potential opportunities there to standardize that approach or something like that.
Mhm.
And I'll just point out that fell out as a specific issue for us in the IREP focus groups as well. So perhaps we can take advantage of some background data that between what you've already put together with respect to the importance and the significance of that as an issue, as well as the misconceptions and kind of suspicion and overall reluctance to engage from patients and stakeholders.
And I remember that, I can't remember which of the three I was on, but telling was that so much of what we talked about related to the patients, Deb, and to make sure that you got some of that information, because it just seemed incredibly relevant to patients and how they sort of perceive all this. So it would be a great combination, maybe even, I don't know if the survey may be too much, but somehow to incorporate the two.
I wonder if this in and of itself is worth seeking some funding to really dive deeper into whether we go, I don't know, Michelle, and maybe Lizette or Pam, you can help us look at some of the core mechanisms that might be available to really kind of bud this out as an entirely separate issue to take on, to really put some teeth into how to address this in a systematic way that will be effective, because that certainly has fallen out for us as well.
The other thing that stood out for me were the number of pediatric specific papers that we identified. And so I wonder if there isn't somebody in our group that has a pediatric bent that wouldn't be interested in a secondary paper looking at the specific challenges in that population.
We could reach out to Dr. Groner, who led the pediatrics panel from AIM-1.
I'd also just recommend maybe Aaron Jensen would be a great person to reach out to with respect to this as well. He's a pediatric surgeon at UCSF, former fellow of Dr. Bulger's. Very
engaged in the COT work.
Yep.
Happy to make that connection too. All right, well, let's move on and let Pam present. She's been doing a lot of thinking about sort of overall communication dissemination. So I wanted to have her run these ideas by you all and get feedback, and I'll take it away, Pam.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, I've drafted a plan that I've kind of laid out here, and I'll also show you what we've built so far. So we've already talked about this. We do plan on writing an executive summary, which will include, as Dr. Bulger said, a brief overview of the project, key priorities from AIM-1, the prompts from AIM-2, the challenges from AIM-3, and conclusions and next steps. So if you have thoughts on I took notes about what you said about what would be good to be included in here, including maybe the top 20 or 25 questions across the panels. I think that's also a great thing that could be included in the executive summary. And if you have other thoughts, let us know at the end here. So as far as dissemination, we have been very grateful for JTACs to include us in the collections tab, which makes it easy for all the NTRAP manuscripts to be read together. So we will work on publicizing that collection. We've already done some of that. At AAST, we've done it. We've done some social media pushes, et cetera. All of our center orgs, I'm working on our next e-newsletter to our center stakeholders, about 5,000 of them, and we'll start pushing out this availability here. Not only, well, the executive summary when we have it ready, but certainly the ability to get to the manuscripts and JTACs. All those specialty societies which were shown, we will make special efforts to get to them, get the executive summary when that's written out to them. We'd like to start scheduling podcasts and social media posts and any podcast that you all know of. I mean, we know TraumaCast, we know a few of them. If you have other suggestions of places where we could get it out to in front of other audiences, that would be great. and perhaps produce a webinar about the results, how to use them, make people or allow people to understand what the data are, give some suggestions, how do you use them, and make this available on YouTube and of course on our website. I have started working on our NTRAP website, which is actually live on our research tab. And so we have a project overview there. We will have the executive summary once that's ready and a slideshow. This is the AIM-1 page so far, where I have gathered all of the AIM-1 panels are all here. You can get to the people on the panel. You can get to the publication itself. You can see everything that we put in the lit review are also available here. There's also a link to the taxonomy, so people could take a look at that and understand, what the tags are that are available to search on across these publications and these data sets. When we have AIM-2, I started on, I'm working with Juan on getting the rest of those connections linked up to the AIM-2 page. AIM-3 will be coming. And then of course, we built this online data access request form. And we've already we pushed this out to the panel leaders last month, or the beginning of this month, I should say. And already within the first day or two, we had 7 or 8 requests for data to do secondary analyses. So we're going to continue to push this out. People can suggest a title for a project. They can, I couldn't gather the whole page here, but you can select which panels, the data from which panels you'd like, or all of them, AIM-1, AIM-2, AIM-3, and people will be able to submit this to us so that we have, as I said, 7 or 8 already to review. And we will send out to them a data use agreement and the publications policy, which we just updated. Currently on the publications committee, you can see here who is there, but we are certainly looking for more people to be on this, and maybe some of these people would like to roll off. We're not sure what the interest level is. You can see the responsibilities there. They're not a lot, but as we get more and more secondary data requests, the committee will be responsible for reviewing those requests and then reviewing the papers before they go to submission. And then I will let Dr. Bulger talk more about follow-up and implementation. We kind of started discussing this after each AIM results, but here is the beginning of the follow-up.
Yeah, so just to go back one first, I think we do have a pretty robust publications policy. I reviewed that with the team yesterday or the day before just to make sure it was up to date, and because we do want to circulate that. I think we could expect to get several requests that may overlap. And so I think the publications committee will need to look at that as well and see whether there's opportunity to combine investigators working together if they have similar topics, so we don't end up with a lot of duplicative work and keeping track of that. And then we've got timelines built into the publication policies to review any abstracts they want to submit to meetings, as well as any manuscripts. So we will have some say in making sure that they're representing the project appropriately and, doesn't get out of hand. But it is going to be more work for the publications committee. So yes, we're looking for volunteers, and if your name is on the list, just let Michelle know if you want to continue to be on the list, because obviously we want to make sure that people have the time to do it. But I think this is an exciting opportunity for us to continue to advance the project by getting our name out there. And in the publications policy, we do say that they need to have NTRAP in the title so that it's easy to identify the manuscript, and I think as those are published, they can be added to that NTRAP collection as well. So any issues with the publications before we get onto the other stuff? Any other thoughts about that process, secondary analysis process?
Eileen, do you know if any subsequent articles will be listed under the collections as well?
That's the plan. Yeah, if by having them put NTRAP in the title, a secondary analysis,
Yeah.
NTRAP, whatever. And by having them go through our publications committee, we'll be able to flag them for JTAX.
Okay.
You know,
That'd be
I,
great.
I guess we can't force everybody to submit to JTAX. If they choose to submit it somewhere else, then it won't be in that collection necessarily, but we'll have it on our website. Yeah. All right. So let's go to the next slide. So I think this is the meat of the discussion. So, as we mentioned, I think some kind of a meeting would be terrific. I think we're leaning on the DoD for that. If you think there's another conference grant, we've been pretty good at these conference grants. If you think there's another conference grant that might be appropriate, maybe the SEC could look at that, Rosemary, to support a meeting that we would host. I don't know. But I'm hoping the DoD will come through with funding for some sort of follow-up meeting, either that's NTRAP specific or where we're part of a follow-up NASA meeting. We are talking about putting in a no-cost extension, just because we have a few things that are not quite done. Our funding currently ends the end of this year, this calendar year, I think. We don't have very much funding left, but I think it's reasonable to put in a no-cost extension given what's left to be done, and because that keeps our line of funding open. And there was some initial interesting comment from Travis Polk at the WST about, could there be a mechanism to keep the project alive? And I said, sure, if you want to keep giving us money. But they can't give us money if we don't have an open line of funding. So I think keeping it open another year while we explore with them if there's some sustainment funding or something that would allow us to, on a rotating basis, revisit a panel area, every 3 or 5 years or something like that, and update it. That would be, I don't know how we do it yet, but that would be nice. So that's the other reason we're talking about that. Yeah.
Sorry, I started to interrupt. Do you think Travis would have any interest in diving deeper into this EFIC issue?
He might,
That a little tangential to the DoD.
might be a little tangential, but I mean, they do support EFIC trials. It's a nightmare working with them on those. We could explore that. And then I'm going to have Michelle give an update on the NTRR, which is actually not dead. Despite
Been
several
resurrected.
attempts to kill it. We have, I think, finally a pathway to resurrect it. And then this data could be housed there. But Michelle, do you want to just give an update to this group about that?
Sure. So you're right, it's not dead. I guess you would say it's in a state of suspended animation at the moment. So it's currently offline because we are in a funding gap. But the good news is that thanks actually to some sleuthing that Pam did on when earmarks were allowed in this year's budget at the federal level, we were able to work with Representative Rupersberger's office in Maryland to submit a community funding project for $1.9 million to bring the repository back online and do all the data curation involved in entering up to about 60 different studies that we identified that we would ideally like to load into the repository. That did go through, it is funded. And we are now talking with Captain Polk about getting that money from the DoD. So it's in the CDMRP, Congressionally Directed Research, Medical Research Program. But they had to figure out how they wanted to have that money, come to us. And there were some different issues about the best way to do it so that then the DoD could require that any of their funded studies that look at trauma must upload their data into that repository. And so they've identified the mechanism for that, which is to make it part of the FITBR, the Federal Interagency TBI repository, so that there would be there'd be parallel repositories, which will work nicely because we ended up selecting the same company and use the same bricks structure to build the repository. So we're working through how all this is actually going to come to fruition, they're going to be issuing a sole source service contract to Center to do the management and provide the subject matter expertise to run the repository. And then they'll be funding, DoD will be funding the back end, which is the funds that go to Sapient Governmental to actually run the repository, the nuts and bolts of the BRIC system. And the great thing about this is that means that if it all goes the way Captain Polk is trying to make it, the DoD will just start routinely supporting the expense for the back end of the NTRR like they do FITBR. So we've been told that we should have our contract in the early spring. And we've met with the person who's going to make that happen. We met with him at MHSRS. And we're continuing to, talk to Captain Polk. I talked to him about it again last week. He assured me it's in the works. So we should be bringing the repository back online in 2023, but I do not have the specifics yet on the timing.
Yeah, so I mean, this has been a labor of love for many people with trying to get this through the DoD, but this is a huge advance. And I think this is sustainment funding for this project with Center as the front end and the DoD as the back end. So I'm very optimistic that we put data in here, we'll actually still be able to get to it. So this will house the NTRAP data, but it will also start to house a lot of the other study data that we have, historical DoD funded study data that's been given to us, as well as future projects like lights and data and things like that. So huge advance, and I think a good way for us to ensure that there's always access to the data. So thank you, Michelle, and the whole team for really pushing on that. So your thoughts on these topics?
This is minor, but it would be something easy to do is when the executive summary comes out, if we can get Raul to select it as the best of, then you may put a little video snippet and then they do a bunch of social media. It would be kind of a nice, then you can use that for some other things as well.
It's a great idea.
Michelle, do you just also, I don't think I'm sure you've told Eileen about what we're doing with respect to the member organizations.
I was just gonna think of that.
We talked about it very briefly before AAST, but you might want to give this group just a quick summary of it.
Sure. So in my former role for the research committee for the COT, myself, Todd, Rosemary, and then the leaderships from the Western Trauma Association Research Division, research folks, Western, East, and AAST all got together, and ABA, I always leave them out accidentally. And the ABA have gotten together now a couple of times. We kind of lost momentum and have regained some momentum, and we now have some language that we are going to ask each to go back to the organizations and get some buy-in to have all of the official multi-center trials that come through those organizations, all of that data be warehoused in the NTR. Additionally, we would require there would be a core data set that would be collected as part of all of those studies. And we would also require the use of a data dictionary to assure consistency in those data fields as they're collected. And so we were going to ask each of the organizations, obviously in your role at AAST and my role at East, Rosemary's role, hey, we got it covered. West East, AAST, done. Good. Just the ABA now to get buy-in so that we can really look and be more cohesive and collaborative in how we're collecting and storing data. So that language went back around. I didn't get a lot of additional feedback. So this is just a matter of each of our research people taking this back to the organizations for approval from our various boards.
Deb, are we meeting again to remind me before we do that, or do everyone agree that we're going to move forward?
I thought we agreed we were going to move forward. The last communication we had about it was when Michelle had mentioned about the gap in funding and kind of timing wise. I didn't want to jump the gun too soon, but I think we're
that's right.
At least ready for people to get buy-in from the organizations before we bring it back together and start talking about what those core elements will be, what that data dictionary will look like. Does that seem, Eileen and anybody else, does that seem like the correct process to use for this?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think just making sure that if those MITC chairs have turned over, that the new people are in the loop as to what the previous discussions have been is really important. The other thing that could go along with this is that we could, and I'm thinking about this for the AAST, but all of our organizations give scholarships, right, for research.
Yep.
We could ask in the scholarship application for the applicant to put in their significance, how their project fits in with the NTRAP research priorities. You know, like it would prompt our junior faculty to be looking at this. It's not a hard thing for them to do, and it would help them frame it, you know, for future grant applications. You know, I think that would be another thing that we could do across the organizations.
I think that's a great idea. I think probably something should come from this group kind of formally to the member organizations to request that, if that makes sense. We could probably bundle it with what we're already putting together. But I love the idea of asking for the member organizations who are supporting like resident or faculty or, you know, research, for that to give some prioritization to those items that are directly addressing NTRAP's identified priorities. I love that. I guess we could probably wrap that up all in one request, right, Michelle? Any reason not to? Todd, Rosemary, any thoughts on that?
No, I agree.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
mean, if you're going to do an important study, you ought to be addressing where there's a gap. I mean, it
Right.
seems pretty, this just highlights it. So I don't think it's not a big ask.
It's not a
Help
big
with
effort.
grant.
I think it will help our community look to this as a source. And those are the people we're funding for these scholarships, they're going to go on and write more grants, right? So this is a way
Right.
for them to realize that this is a resource for them. It's a win-win, I think.
Okay, I will add that. I'll send that back out in a communication to the group to perhaps add some language around that as an additional part of this ask around how center, and we're kind of framing it as this is how center is going to help support each of the member organizations, right? This is what you're getting back, right? You're
Yeah.
getting access to the NTR, where you're getting, right? You're getting, so this, I like the back and forth.
you know, I would make sure that it actually goes almost as a separate communication on this ask, just for the simple reason, I think that it would make it stand out a little bit more, because I think if you try and bundle it in with other things, it could get lost.
Okay.
I think if it goes separately, it helps to make it stand alone. And I think that that's going to be more important.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I appreciate that feedback. Maybe Rosemary, probably the right person for it to come from would probably be you as the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee. Or does that need to come from Ben as the chair of the, I don't know. I just don't think it should come from me necessarily.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little tangential.
Maybe Ben, but we can talk, yeah, we'll figure out,
Okay.
but I think we should do
I'll
that.
stop by your office later. We'll figure it out. Got it.
You know where to find me?
We do have the SAC meeting on Monday too, so we could kick this around there.
Perfect.
It's our scientific advisory committee. And then just so you all know, we have another meeting scheduled with that smaller MITC group
We do,
at
okay.
the end of November. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail the conversation. I apologize.
No, that's what one of the reasons I wanted to have this meeting, make sure we tie all these things together. So it's perfect.
I apologize. I completely lost track of time. I have to run, but if there's anything else I can help with, please let me know.
All right, thanks.
Thank you guys.
Deb.
Good to see you all. Feel better, Eileen.
Thank you.
Hi, Deb.
All right, anything else?
I think we have one or two more slides, Pam.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Well, thank you. Okay, that's good. Thank you. Yeah.
There are really 471 Delphi panel members. That's impressive.
And
Yeah,
Pam
great.
mentioned all of them.
They remember my name, let's just say that.
That's impressive.
It truly is. Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Saddle.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Night.
All right. Well, I think if we don't have other ideas, I think we can wrap up here. It's always good to end a little early. It's like the airlines, if you land before your ETA,
That's right.
well, loves you, right? So, so thanks, everybody. And if you have any other ideas that come up or any other
Yeah.
thoughts about how we can better coordinate or better disseminate the material, please let us know and we'll keep pushing on some of those bigger deliverables.
And Michelle, can we just remind me that we should put this on the agenda too, just as an
Yes.
add-on to this, to see if any, just some different people hearing it and see if they have some other ideas.
Yes.
And there was one thing at the bottom that said, the last slide, DoD implementation scientist. I wasn't sure what that meant, but we certainly should think about, and wouldn't this be like a great project for implementation and dissemination?
Yeah, I think I was thinking there that if the DoD is willing to come through with some sustainment funding, one of the asks should be to add an implementation expert to our group,
Yeah,
because it really has become its own language in its own field. And I think that would open us up to additional grant funding opportunities as well for many
Yeah.
things. So, that could be something that we could put in a budget for continuing funding if
That's
that
what this-
becomes an option.
that's a great idea, because, there's a bunch of NIH calls for that, but we're just, this just isn't us. Lacey and the Grown wrote a great conference grant, and it's certainly
Right.
knowledgeable in that. So I think we have some people that are starting in Elliott.
Mhm.
But you would think if the military is putting all this money into this, they'd want something to happen with it. I mean, that's a great idea.
Yeah. So it's in the back of my mind as we try to see what the funding opportunities are.
Pam, would you be able to send around a list of the secondary analysis that have been requested or ongoing? Because I think
Yeah.
there's some that need to be done. And I'd just be interested to see who's working on what and what gaps need to be filled there.
Absolutely. I'll send it after this.
And the stat, we should explain the status on that. So we sent out an announcement to the panel members, giving them first shot. And they don't, the embargoes, the 1-year embargoes do not apply if you were on a panel. And so Pam started a spreadsheet keeping track of those requests. We gave them to the end of this month. And our plan was to put them, to send them out to the publications committee in early October to ask for their feedback on them. So none of them have been executed as of yet, but happy to go ahead and send that to this group. That'd be great.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Great discussion, great input. Good to see you all.
Likewise, hope you
And
feel
we'll be
better,
in touch.
Eileen.
Oh, it's getting better.
Please
Getting
feel better.
It's post WST COVID. Seems to be a trend. It's a theme we have.
That's right.
All right. Thank you,
care. Have a
guys.
good-
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.